Yes, Miss Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to ask you about the knife at Hayfield Road.
Okay.
And very quickly, let's just look at PS 00280, which is a statement that you prepared on the 4th of May 2015. And if we look at page 3 of that statement at paragraph 10, which is the second last paragraph on that page. I'm reading the wrong bit. Sorry, it's page 3, paragraph 4. And you mention that there was a suggestion to look in the north side of in Hayfield Road on the grass area, and DC Connell was instructed to look for this item. So he's one of the other CID officers that had come with, you mentioned earlier, with Samantha Davidson.
That's correct.
And in relation to the recovery of this knife, I think at paragraph 9, so just a little bit below the third last paragraph on this page, it starts owing to the risk. You say, owing to the risk that this posed with members of the public being in the immediate vicinity and the potential evidential value, I instructed DC Connell and DS Davidson to record the position of the knife and take possession of same. The inclement weather conditions were also a factor in this decision with regards to securing best evidence. I also noted at least 3 police batons on the roadway near to the mail, and the officers are instructed that these be recorded and recovered by DC Connell and DS Davidson from a public safety perspective. So could you tell us a little bit more about the rationale in terms of the knife at Hayfield Road?
Yeah, obviously before the break you'd obviously asked questions in terms of the kind of location of Mr Bow and the officers, and I think when myself and DS Davidson spoke, we were trying to understand what our role would then be, trying to understand what crimes or offences we would be looking at investigating, and whether there was a role for the CID. So with Mr Bow under control, we then looked at the other elements in terms of evidence. So we spoke about the knife, spoke about the batons, and I think at that time I was under the impression that we didn't need to preserve them in situ and that the matter had concluded. So in terms of the officer safety perspective, the public safety perspective and the evidential value, I was satisfied at that time for the officers to go and record and recover them, with the intention that the police would soon be leaving that scene following the conclusion of the incident.
And can we look at paragraph 72 of your first inquiry statement, which is 133? And let's look at paragraph 72, please. And you were asked in this section about the knife, and you've said, the method that we did that was basically photos on the phone, was it the right thing to do? Yes, at the time, on reflection. Now, no, because I know what ensued with cops getting their phones taken off them. But the reality of the incident, of what seemed minor at that stage, wouldn't have merited scenes of crime coming to record the knife. Also, the whole provision of custody cameras was a disaster back then. So the process was that with technology and digitally enabled phones, take a photo. We could get a printout with the Bluetooth printers, we can get a printout of the knife, and we could put production label on it, and that was common practice. Can you tell us a little bit more about this paragraph? You say that basically it was photos on the phone.
Yes, so having the decision, and my decision, that we would basically record and recover the items that's outlined in the previous paragraphs in terms of the police equipment and the knife. We could do it with the methods of recording accurately in the notebook in terms of a narrative, but naturally photos would generally tell a better picture in terms of helping outline for any future prosecution that where these items were recovered from. Again, the limitations at that time and access to what would be a scenes of crime officer attending in terms of availability on that day, the time that would take, and also when I talk about the provision of a custody camera as a production camera, which is usually on site within police stations, which is effectively a digital camera that would be used for productions in the station. And there was obviously a direction at that time they weren't to be taken out to any scene. So again, with the technology that existed with phones, there became a culture of officers recording images on their phone of any types of property or evidence. The digital printers that we had access to thereafter effectively then becoming physical items in terms of documentary productions that would then be submitted as evidence as to whatever, any particular case or incident that was under investigation.
And was that a culture that existed only in Kirkcaldy, or was it wider throughout Fife?
I think, at that time I can only speak for Fife, but policing in general, just because of the limitation in terms of our access to technology to do our job better.
And in paragraph 73, let's remain with 72 for a moment. You say, was it the right thing to do? Yes, at the time, on reflection. Now, no, because I know what ensued when cops getting their phones taken off them. Can you explain that sentence or those sentences to me?
So I was satisfied that we had the pictures. I suppose it was just the methods, and it was the right thing to do at that time with what we had access to. So I'm satisfied that the photos exist, as opposed to if we were just to recover and for then the officers just to have to speak to the location and recovery of that simply through a statement, and how obviously statements can be construed, interpreted. So it was to support a statement, and obviously by taking the photo to give a indication to where these items, as we've described, would be.
And were these personal phones owned by the officers, or were they police phones?
No. So again, I think at that time I would be the only one with a works or an organisation phone. Again, the limitations with that would just be more phone and emails as opposed to any kind of digital enabled. So it was the officers' phones.
Their own personal phones.
And in terms of the regret of that is that their phones were subsequently seized, rightly so, as productions in the case. So they were minus their phones. So in terms of the personal level, in terms of them having their phones seized, but at that time it was probably, as I thought, the best thing to do.
So that was personal inconvenience to officers who had their personal phones seized. And then in paragraph 73, you say, I know the implications of that now with hindsight. What do you mean by that?
I think it was implications of them having their phones taken off them. If it was a Police Scotland issued device, obviously that would have been approved, and the fact that there would then be a process to how we download, transfer the imagery or footage taken from that. And I think I go on to say that we now have PDAs, or officers are now issued with PDAs which can capture digital evidence.
Instead of using their own personal phones,
Yes.
They've got equipment.
Yes.
But in 2015 was the only option really on that morning, their personal phones.
It wasn't the only option, because there was the option to leave these items in situ. Again, it was balancing kind of that justification rationale of what we were assessing to have at that time in terms of crimes or offences. I think we in consultation with my colleagues, just understand that we're of a view that the matter had concluded, and this was a case of just recovering the items, evidence there, with a view to leaving the area shortly thereafter. Again, how I saw it playing out was that Mr. Bow had been taken into custody, and the police presence from the area diminishing, maybe a bit of residue in terms of door-to-door, etc., but more straightforward conventional inquiries.
And so the alternative you've mentioned earlier was a scenes of crime coming to record the knife. What would that have involved?
So, and I think as I referred to earlier, in terms of the couple of officers that we've used for effectively traffic control, in terms of that officer public safety element, we would have put in scenes of crime measures and retained the integrity of that scene. Appreciating now what played out, that I wouldn't have ever touched those items. They would have been left in situ, and we would have put a locus protection around that to maintain the integrity.
And when you talk about integrity, are you talking about forensic integrity?
Just the best evidence is just really leaving that scene as we found it. and then thereafter you can put protocols in place to work through and how you would retrieve and recover the best evidence from that scene.
So in removing items from the scene, it wasn't left as it had been because of the actions of the officers removing items?
No, and I was happy to, at that time with what we thought we were dealing with, I was happy with that audit trail of that was the decisions that we made and for those reasons.
Okay. And then if we can look up at 73, just move up the screen a little. You talk about in hindsight, if we knew what was going to play out, and that stuff would have been left in situ for scene of crime. But it was the right thing to do with information at the time in terms of what was proportionate with inclement weather. It was light drizzle. What did you mean about the weather? What impact did that have on your decision making?
So we know that inclement weather can diminish potentially the forensic value of any items. Again, by leaving them in situ, there's other measures that we can put in place depending on what the circumstances are in terms of to cover these items, again with the intention of leaving them in situ for best evidence. But there is obviously times if the weather was to play a factor, we would do the same.
And would it have been possible to leave things in situ at that time and cover them?
Yes, again then to where the access or where we went to get the access to these tents, and we do have other articles that we can put across, even if it was getting a box. Just again, all part of that justification rationale.
And then you also mention losing control with the members of the public that were starting to congregate. Tell us about that.
So again, taking maybe the side of the integrity of the scene, with it being in a public place, I think with the attendance of the police and just its location near to a garage, there started to be a bit of traffic in terms of vehicles and with pedestrians. So as part of that locus protection would be keeping them away from the risks of the scene, including the knife.
Thank you. Can we move on to a period of time, 7:25, 17 hours? So can I ask you to look at the spreadsheet again, please? And this is on page 7 of the spreadsheet. Seven 25:17. And it's an airwaves transmission from PC Smith. Roger, this male now certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him. As I understand, you remained at the scene at that time when that airwaves transmission was relayed over the radios. Do you remember hearing that?
I don't recall that. I was of a view that I'd obviously taken on another role by transporting an officer to the hospital.
Right. I'll come on to that at the moment then. If you look at page 10, so we're on 7 at the moment. If you look at page 10 and look at 7:28:40, it's halfway down page 10. And it's an airwaves transmission from yourself, DI Colin Robson, control from Papa Whiskey 400, just giving you ambulance attend for the male on the ground. I'm going to convey PC Short down to A&E, a short distance. They just complained of an injury to the back of her head, so I'll get her checked out. When you transmitted that message at 7:28:46, did you remain at the scene at that time?
If the message, in terms of the chronological order, so that airwave message that you've just referred to, I would have been at the scene, but I don't think, I was aware that an ambulance had been requested in terms of to check over the male. I don't think I was aware that he'd lost consciousness.
Right. Let's look at page 7 again, please, and look at halfway down, 7:25:17. So the message from PC Smith. So this is 3 pages back.
Yep.
You were at the scene at this time.
Yes.
And it says, Roger, this male now certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him. So that was a message where an ambulance was called for the male.
Okay.
And it seems to be saying unconscious breathing. Do you remember that?
I don't know.
You don't. So let's go back, please, to the time of 7:26:52. So this is on page 8. So it's about a third of the way down, 7:26:52. It's an airways transmission from Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell. It says, just for the log, the initial on attendance, this male's attacked PC Short quite violently. As a result, he was sprayed with CS and Pava and battened there. There may be a suggestion that he has been battened to the head area, 4-1 over. Do you remember hearing that transmission?
No, all as I recall is that an ambulance had been requested to check him over. I think if I was in receipt of that other information, that I don't think that would have changed actually the initial justification rationale. I knew that there had been physical contact between the police and Mr. Bile, and that an ambulance had been called to check him over.
When you say initial justification rationale, what do you mean?
In terms of my actions and decisions around in terms of recovery of the items. I think if I knew from the outset that we're dealing with an unconscious male, and that the fact that could have, well, we unfortunately know the outcome, I think there would have been a stop and pause at that time in terms of not recovering that. So I think I was working on the premise that we were more as a precautionary measure, we were asking for an ambulance for the male, as opposed to that he was in need of urgent medical assistance.
So if we look back at page 7, and there have been requests for an ambulance for PC Short, but on page 7 we see the message from Smith, 7:25:17, which is halfway down that page. The male appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him. So that is a request for an ambulance for the male, and you were aware of that request?
Simple request, not the further the finer detail. And again, within being in conversation and my excellent reflection, knowing if my airway was potentially in the car at that time, obviously because I was out physically speaking to the officers, with everything else ongoing, I can't recall the finer detail of that message. I was simply told that an ambulance had been requested for him.
Who told you?
I think it was in discussion with either DS Davidson, and I know obviously Sergeant Maxwell was there as well.
We've heard a lot of officers wear their radios on their uniform, often on their shoulder. Is that not something that you wouldn't take your radio with you?
So I was in civilian clothes, so I didn't have the option for that. And even if I did take my handheld out the car when I stopped, I think because I was in conversation, because I was there at that time, I suppose the radio messages weren't as important as we were before I attended.
So you weren't listening to the airways messages as you were at the scene?
Mainly because I was at the scene interacting with the officers that were there.
Right. So although you knew or had been told about the ambulance, you weren't aware that he was unconscious at that stage?
No.
When did you become aware that he was unconscious?
My recollection, I think it's reflected in the statement, was, and again accurate in terms of I made that message about taking Nicole Short to the hospital. Again, assessing my involvement and my need to be there, having discussed with my colleagues in terms of each element of the incident, that I thought my role was done. Having attended as the police officer as opposed to the SIO, that it kind of ceased my involvement. So as an assistance to my colleagues, and knowing I didn't know the ETA of an ambulance, and if it was going to be one ambulance, I would rather naturally went to Mr. Rye as opposed to Nicole, and the hospital was in short distance away. So as a kind of conclusion, I suppose, to my involvement, I took Nicole to the hospital.
Did you think the ambulance would come from the hospital nearby?
With their previous experience, no. It could come from various locations, knowing the demand on the ambulance service.
Right.
And it's once I'd dropped Nicole Short off at the hospital, when I came out, so I'm assuming I didn't take my airwave in, I heard on the airwave or the unit within the vehicle, there was a sense of urgency around about the estimated time of arrival for the ambulance, and that's when I knew that circumstances had changed.
I'll come back to your statement in a moment. When you took the decision to take PC Short to A&E, At that time, you've told us you were duty SIO for the Fife area.
Yeah.
Were you the most senior officer at the scene at that point?
I was, yes.
And why did you decide to take Nicole Short to the hospital yourself instead of asking one of the other ranks of officers, maybe lower ranks, DC?
So
PC.
obviously, I think as it's the chronology of it, I'd kind of tasked and would decided between DS Davidson and that they would do the record and recover element. So I suppose they had a job. PS Maxwell was obviously overseeing his uniformed officers. The other any spare uniform officers were then doing the role in terms of traffic control or the wider kind of public safety element. So I was. Nicole Short could have been there and we could have waited for the ambulance. I was intending to leave, and it was more as a to conclude my involvement that I would provide the support by taking her to hospital. Because the intention, again, with that I would go back and continue on with my prescribed duties in terms of SIO for the division.
So when you initially left with Nicole Short, what was your plan after you dropped her at the hospital?
I would have returned to the police station.
You hadn't originally intended to return to Hayfield Road?
Because I didn't see the need. I felt my role had concluded.
Thank you. You've described in your one of your statements that you took PC Short to hospital and you described it as a 2-minute journey. And we've heard other evidence that Victoria Hospital's very nearby.
You could see it from where we were, yeah.
And if we could look at PS 00280, please. So this is your original operational statement. And if we can look at page 3, please, paragraph 10, which is the second last on this. Here it is. I then conveyed PC Short to Victoria Hospital, Kirkcaldy, and placed her in the care of medical staff. During the journey, which would have lasted approximately 2 minutes, PC Short recalled being on the ground and seeing the male's foot coming towards her head. And where was she when she shared that with you? Was it in the car or in the hospital?
In the car. I had very little dialogue with her at the hospital once I'd put her into the care of the staff.
Describe her demeanour in the car.
Very upset. Upset and a bit confused, I would suppose, kind of dazed.
Was there any mention of any other injury by her at that time?
If there was, it would be contained within the statement.
So in the absence of anything else in your statement, can we assume there was nothing else said?
I don't recall anything else.
Can we look at your first inquiry statement, which is the 133 statement? And if we can look at paragraph 76, please. And it's really, so we can be completely clear, you say in paragraph 76 of this statement, you can't really recall the conversation. I think to her it seemed a bit of a blur, but she did indicate that she'd been stamped on the head. And then at 77, you say there wouldn't be a conversation because it wouldn't be long enough. She was upset, no obvious injury, but did say that she'd been stamped on, her head stamped on. That's about, if anything, it would just be that. But then I think it was explained to you in your original statement, which we've just looked at, that you recalled at that time on the 4th of May that she saw a foot coming towards her head rather than saying she'd been stamped on her head. And I think at paragraph 80 you say, I made an assumption. If she's complaining of a sore head and all she can remember is a foot coming towards her, then the assumption is she's been stamped on. Did she say that? He'd stamped on my head? Couldn't recall, to be honest. What I'm saying might have been tainted to what I've read in the media since, potentially, but she was definitely complaining of a sore head, no overt injury, upset, and the recollection of a foot. And so again, you've obviously clarified that you think that was an assumption you made, and you prefer your original statement as to what she said. I'm interested again in the idea of maybe things you've read in the media having tainted your own recollection, and trying to assess to what extent that's happened. You know, with your recollection regarding Nicole Short, for example, you've obviously said different things at
Yeah,
different
and my initial
times.
statement would be probably the most accurate, and I know, and probably even just not to support it, but I know prior to taking her to hospital, I think I was told during conversation with DS Davidson and Sergeant Maxwell that she'd been stamped on. So I've obviously, she's not potentially not reiterated that to me. And in terms of the original statement about a foot coming towards her, and that's all she can remember, is maybe more accurate to then how I've effectively potentially joined the two in terms of what I was told, to my recollection, to then what's played out since.
Right. So you're getting information from lots of different sources.
Yeah.
Maybe the radio messages, maybe DS Davidson or other officers. And since then, since the events in 2015, you've obviously seen some media which might have influenced your recollection.
Definitely, but so the original one was probably more accurate, given the fact that was within the 24-hour time period, and that I've not potentially been influenced by what I've been told by Sergeant Maxwell and DS Davidson. But again, knowing that would be third hand as well, effectively.
Okay. And then I think in your first inquiry statement, which we have on the screen, if we look at paragraphs, well, from 121 to 125, I think you do try to give an explanation to the chair about what you've seen on the media, and although you've tried to watch very, very little of it, sometimes it's been unavoidable, as you say.
That's correct.
So, and you've listened to some views expressed by others, and that's prompted a reaction in relation to things you think are maybe wrong or incorrect or
That's
subjective, correct. I think is the other word that you use.
Yes.
So. And then just to be clear, because you did mention it a moment ago, if we go back to 280, page 3, paragraph 11, you said a moment ago, and I said I'd come back to it, you said, I then made my way back in the direction of Locust Hayfield Road and was aware of radio traffic which confirmed that the male had appeared to have stopped breathing. Police officers had commenced CPR and there was a request on the ETA of the ambulance, which at that time was 4 minutes. And so you were in the car coming back from Victoria Hospital with Nicole Short when you heard that airwave message.
I'd literally got in the car, and again, probably in support that prior to getting out of the car, going to the hospital, I wasn't aware that he was unconscious.
Right. And then just for completeness, if we look at page 11 of the spreadsheet, the combined audio-video timeline, and you'll see towards the top of that page, 7:29:30, this is an airwaves message from Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell. Do you see that? And it says, Control, can you get a move on with the ambulance? This accused is now not breathing. CPR is commencing. Over. Is that the message you think you probably heard in the car coming back?
It definitely emphasis, whether it was that one or the emphasis on where's this ambulance.
Yeah. Could we look at page 13 of the spreadsheet? I'm going to ask that a section be played of the evidence video timeline, but before I do that, you'll see if we start at 7:33 and 47 seconds, and you'll see that timing in the second column in, and it says at the top, DI Colin Robson. Inspector K from dog code DI Robson. And then K says go ahead, and then you say, I'm just going to attend here, I'm going to initiate locust protection measures, the natural boundaries with the junction, but just coordination and some traffic management. So I'll ask that that section be played up till 7:43. And before I do that, so that seems to begin with a conversation between you and Inspector K, who we heard previously was the PIO that day. And then I'll ask, once that's finished, I'll ask you some questions.
You're quite violently.
So it's from 7:33 and 47 seconds or thereabouts.
Sector K from DI Robson. Right. I'm just going to attend to your, obviously I'm going to initiate locust protection measures in the natural boundaries of the junction, but there's some coordination and traffic management, etc. I'm on to locust. Control, Roger. Control from the LLC. Go ahead. Just to confirm, ambulance attendants are listening to this mail. If we confirm it's another ambulance attendant, we do have officers exposed to CS spray and obviously other physical attack. PT shot has been dropped off at the hospital in Kevin. Once the ambulance leaves the mail, just for the welfare of the other officers.
Yeah, we've asked for 2 ambulances.
Locust protection measures have been put in place at Hayfield Road, junction with Henry Road, and also along Hayfield Road.
Roger. The messages are virtually unreadable because of the wind noise. I think I've got everything so far apart from that last bit.
Right. Yeah, obviously go ahead, nothing to say. Yeah, we need to look at, obviously once the ambulance do leave and officers are checked, the end release, they will have to be stood down in the front of the station. It's going to have to be spoken to in relation to this matter. I'll also look at the CID results for supervision and get up to attend to clearance. Yes, yes, I'll be there in about 2 hours.
That's fine, thank you. So can I go back to page 13, 7:33, 54 hours. You say, I'm just going to attend here. I'm going to initiate locust protection measures. So by this time you're aware that the man was unconscious. He's not breathing and the ambulance is on its way and in fact very shortly after that arrives at the scene. and you've now decided you're initiating locust protection measures. So explain how things had changed from this point.
So again, I think I explained my kind of position as I was leaving, with the intention obviously dropping Nicole short off and then returning to the police station, that I suppose how I thought it would play out is that Mr. Bayo would be removed, conveyed back to the police station by the officers, having been taken into custody. By that time also, DS Davison and TC Connell would have recorded and recovered the officer safety equipment and the knife, and more or less that would have negated the majority of the police presence if there was, and again I would have probably then left that to the sergeant to what inquiries needed to be done around the initial incident in terms of...
Would that be Sergeant Maxwell?
Maxwell, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
So it was effectively, I was happy to leave that and for the uniformed officers to deal with the matter. Whether it required CID consultation, I don't know, but I envisaged that we would all leave that area shortly thereafter, and the police presence would be stood down.
Once you realised that the male was unconscious and not breathing, he'd required an ambulance, what then did you do?
So it's them appreciating that that's going to be a protracted scene potentially. So again, the basic principles of scene locus preservation in terms of protecting, preserving the integrity of what was left, having explained that I would already recorded and removed key items. And I think you could obviously it's shown there in on the footage of the officer standing at the roundabout with I think there's barrier tape, and I think I've explained about the natural boundaries that by using the houses on the south, and also I think there's a fence just north of the grass area, that we could contain with that in terms of no person could get no person could get within that scene unless obviously authorised.
And what are the reasons for implementing locust protection measures?
Really just to preserve what you have in that area in terms of at that stage not knowing what the kind of forensic yield or potential would be. So it is a case of you cast your net round it, and thereafter when you work through, and it would be the kind of strategy around that locust protection and what form of examination to what extent you would. But by securing it there allows you've got control of that, and you don't then need to make any other immediate actions or decisions until maybe you've got further information.
So once you heard the airwaves message, you rerouted to Hayfield Road.
That's right.
And then the procedures you put in place were different to what you'd originally intended.
That's correct, but with the exception of the barrier tape and the officers covering any kind of route, be it vehicle or foot traffic, there wasn't much to do to then preserve that.
Right. And you say it's 7:36 and 48 hours, so that's back onto page 14 of the spreadsheet. 7:36 and 48 hours, just above middle. And you talk about once the ambulances do leave and the officers are checked for injuries, they'll have to be stood down and returned to the station, obviously not to be spoken to in relation to this matter. And then you say you'll go on to look at CID resources across the division. Explain what you meant when you said obviously not to be spoken to in relation to this matter.
So I think again, that kind of working strategy at the time, there's various strands to any investigation, so locus is one element of that. You've got various strands around victims, witnesses, door to door. So the element I was thinking that these officers are obviously witness to what's taken place. They were no longer deployable because they form part of the investigation. They would have to be stood down effectively and taken back to the police station, again by getting control, and once that control's in place can allow then for that further information gathering and decisions around the next steps.
At that time, did you have a clear idea of who the officers were that would have to be sent back and taken off deployment?
It was more or less, as I understand, the whole shift had responded, or the available resource of that morning at that time had responded. So there was the whole shift effectively off the scene, off the road, I know obviously we've used officers. I think potentially the officer there on the camera was part of that shift. So again, that would be once resources had been sourced from elsewhere to basically relieve them of their duties and again become part of the officers that were to be taken back to the police station. So first and foremost, from the welfare perspective, I think it's outlined there in terms of being subject to or have a spray, but it was more just let's get them back first and foremost, and then the next steps would be identified thereafter.
And when you say the whole shift, do you mean the response team,
Yeah.
effectively?
And Sergeant Maxwell was going to oversee that in my eyes.
So although Sergeant Maxwell had been at Hayfield Road, you thought he would continue to take the role of overseeing the response team?
At that time, because I was of the view he'd attended in that periphery element, like DS Davidson and DC Connell, and not attended as part of the initial response. And not that I was trying to differentiate, but as responsibility for the sergeant on the shift, he was going to. I was satisfied for him to ensure that the remaining officers there that hadn't taken to hospital and didn't need to go to hospital in terms of the purpose of the second ambulance would be returned to the police station.
And how did you reassure yourself that Sergeant Maxwell could continue that day with his responsibilities?
At the time, at the scene there, I didn't, because we were going to have to leave and we were going to have to get back to the station in some way. And on reflection, I don't know if I ever did. So that's something I would need to consider in terms of his welfare. He was like the other supervisors, including myself, and having that supervisory responsibility. Again, appreciating I'm talking about the welfare of the officers, that I maybe should have considered his welfare as well.
I mean, looking back now, do you think how would you have gone about checking on his own welfare?
Asking him if he had the capacity and his own resilience to do it. So again, just directly, are you okay to continue? That's
not something you did at the time?
Not something I probably would have done at Hayfield, but on reflection, it's something I probably should have considered, and the kind of timeline that you're going to in terms of interaction at the police station.
When you were away from the scene, taking Nicole Short to the hospital, who was the most senior officer at the scene at that time as far as the situation was when you left?
It would be joint collectively in terms of DS Davidson doing the record and recover bit of the items, and then Sergeant Maxwell in terms of his staff.
Were they, in terms of seniority, were they on a par?
Both the same rank, yeah, just different responsibilities.
When you'd obviously tasked DC Connell with recovering the knife.
Yeah.
And then can we look at 280, PS 00280, page 4, paragraph 3. Whilst dealing with the mail, I was aware that DS Davidson, do you see that bit?
Yeah,
Paragraph 3. Had arranged for DC Connell to accompany the male in the ambulance to assist the medical staff with CPR and to provide updates on his condition and attempt to establish his identity. Was there any concern in your mind about forensic integrity, given that the knife had been recovered by DC Connell, but he was also the officer in the ambulance with the male?
I suppose not. In terms of obviously the actions in terms of recovery of the knife were pre the decision to accompany, but in terms of the reality, there was nobody else available. As I obviously explained in terms of how the incident had kind of consumed the whole uniform presence. The other officers were used for the locus protection. DC Connell was pretty much the only alternative, and I was satisfied. And again, it's about the justification rationale that, yeah, potential cross-contamination down the line, but as long as we've not hidden the fact that DC Connell has went, because that strand, I mean, in terms of victim, that they become a scene in themselves.
And is this a rationale that you're providing now with hindsight, or is it a rationale that you went through in your mind, reasoning that you went through at the time?
I was never going to stop and pause to decide if DC Connell, being effectively the only officer left, could do it, because the priority was getting Mr. Bay at hospital, Mr. Bay at hospital, sorry.
And looking back now, do you have any concerns about forensic integrity in that situation?
No, because I think, not knowing, unfortunately, because I wasn't involved in the full investigation of what the forensic intentions were, but if there was to be forensic anomalies, they could be potentially explained because DC Connell's involvement with the knife and then potentially his contact with Mr. Byle.
Can I ask you to look at page 15 of the spreadsheet? And you'll see at 7:43, moving on to page 16 of the spreadsheet, 7:43:05. This is an airwaves transmission from you. Just for the call card, DS Dursley from Levenmouth is arranging a CID resource from Division to attend at Kirkcaldy Police Station in relation to the aspect of the investigation. Chief Inspector Stone's updated and is going to contact the on-call super. Tell us what you were doing round about that time when you made that transmission.
So again, and obviously taken from the limited resource we had, naturally was going to be actions and investigation that we needed to do as a result of what had played out. So DC Connell's at the hospital, DS Davis is obviously overseeing things at the scene. Sergeant Maxwell is obviously looking after his staff and going back to the station. As I say, there was no other police resource in Kirkcaldy, and I suppose part of the benefits of divisional cover and the organisations that we do have resources elsewhere. So I would be aware of who would be on, and it was to contact them to attend, to assist with any actions and investigations that needed to take place thereafter.
And was it you that contacted DS Dursley at that time?
I would imagine so, yeah. I don't recall, but I would imagine via mobile phone, knowing that I had no resource would be to phone where I did know there was resource, and yeah, I would probably have just phoned DS Dursley direct. And
it says Chief Inspector Stone's updated. Was it you that updated him?
Yes, if I recall, maybe, and I think I explained at the very start in terms of that kind of on-call duty weekend cover, that there would have been a Chief Inspector on for Fife Division, and that was Chief Inspector Stone's. As I recall, he was based at Dunfermline. So again, it was just to contact him to keep him apprised of what my intentions and actions were.
And was he your sort of senior manager?
So for the structure that was in place to cover that weekend, yes, he was, and he would be effectively the most senior on-duty officer
in Fife
on that day,
in
with the
Kirkcaldy?
provision of an on-call structure beyond that obviously gets activated as well.
We've heard his name mentioned by Inspector Kay, Acting Inspector, who was the PIO, and he had also mentioned him in relation to speaking to Chief Inspector Stones that day. So was that, he was part of that area, that Fife Division, was he that day?
Yeah, and given his role, ordinarily every other day, the PIO would probably have more regular contact with the Chief Inspector, just showing that the variety matters. If I have cause in terms of investigation, crime management orientated, there's a parallel on-call structure as well.
Right. And then there was mention of is going to contact the on-call super. Was that Stones that was going to contact the on-call super?
In terms of the uniform on-call superintendent, as opposed to what would be my detective on-call superintendent. So as I say, there's parallels, again, just for the variety of roles and responsibilities and matters that go on across policing on a daily basis.
So if Stones was going to contact the on-call uniform super, who was that?
I couldn't tell you.
And did you contact the on-call
Detective. Yeah.
super?
So probably simultaneously, again with a different purpose and intention.
And the detective super on call that day was Pat Campbell,
That's correct.
we've heard. And so you contacted him at some point. And in terms of the CID part of this, which you were part of, can you explain what their role would be that day then?
So it would be for me to update them on all priority matters, I think, as I outlined that kind of structure, my roles and responsibilities of the on-call or the duty SIO, is that ordinarily, and I phoned him fairly quickly after we know how the direction that was going, but ordinarily I would phone him on a daily basis to update him on all matters Fife related to what I thought had the threshold to bring to his attention. And it was more as that kind of quality assurance peer review of this is what we've got, this is my actions, decisions, more for him to concur or maybe give me other considerations to take into account as part of that kind of peer support. And then his role as the wider organisational would be anything that he needed to feed into senior management.
So when did you view this incident at Hayfield Road as a priority event?
As soon as I came out of the hospital and heard about the change in circumstances.
So even as you were travelling back, rerouted back to Hayfield Road?
Yeah, which was, again, the short distance, and I only drove out effectively a short distance and stopped where I relayed those radio messages in terms of the locus protection, and that pretty much happened the same time that I was speaking to Inspector Kay and shortly thereafter making the phone call to the Detective Superintendent.
And earlier we spoke about you initially responding to the calls that you'd heard as I used the word reinforcements, and asked about your responsibilities as on-duty SIO. So can you explain when you first arrived at Hayfield Road, if we could summarise that as you being there to support your colleagues, but then the second time you arrived at Hayfield Road after you've dropped off Nicole Short at hospital, what was the reason and the basis on which you arrived the second time?
Yeah, as I say, my role and purpose had changed at the elevate that I had the SIO thinking cap on in terms of the needs and priorities of that investigation.
So was that the point, the second time you arrived, the point at which you were there as Senior Investigating Officer?
Yeah, more or less, albeit when I first attended and we had the discussion with DS Davidson, DC Connell about the recovery, I wouldn't need an SIO to give that instruction. If in my absence DS Davidson and DC Connell could have arrived at the same decision and done that, I wouldn't essentially need my authority, but I was there, so I was consulted and I effectively gave that decision.
And you at that time, when you were there the first time, were the most senior officer there. But on the second time you arrived at Hayfield Road, you were there as on-duty SIO, effectively.
Yes.
So when you arrived the second time, you were the most senior officer, and were you in charge as SIO?
That's correct, yeah.
So from that time, you were in charge of the investigation?
Yes.
And in relation to DS Dursley, you mentioned him in the call. Can you explain to us what his relationship and his role was in relation to your role that day?
So he was the equivalent of DS Davidson, but his natural function would be covered leaving mouth. So again, just a different area, but performing the exact same function as DS Davidson.
But he was brought to Kirkcaldy to help?
Yes, in the same vein as my interaction with DS Davidson in terms of that discussion of what we're trying to achieve.
So if DS Davidson is in the same role, the same rank, why bring DS Dursley from Leavenmouth? Because
I think I've obviously explained that refined resource. DS Davidson has effectively been, her priority is the locus, also as part of overseeing DC Connell that had went with a while to the hospital. So again, it's that whole resilience piece is that, they've only got limited capacity and want them to do those roles obviously to the fullness and best ability. So it's just that resilience and extra resource. It's also helped in terms of that independence, the fact that DS Dursley and the officers that become are not directly involved. So it's the same that you've talked about, the kind of forensic integrity and that kind of cross-contamination. They're effectively not involved, so could conduct investigations out with having been at Locus.
Did you have any other DSs working with you in that investigation?
Not on that day, no. And I'm even not too sure if there was others on duty. Again, it would just depend on the resource levels of that day owing to other commitments. It kind of fluctuated in terms of weekend to weekend for other commitments.
So we've heard other evidence that DS Davidson went to Victoria Hospital, was engaged with identification of the male. You've talked to us about the locus protection she helped with. Was the person at Kirkcaldy Police Office that day mainly involved in the DS role? Was that DS Dursley?
It became DS Dursley, yeah.
So from the moment he arrived at Kirkcaldy?
Yes, correct.
And was it you that briefed him on his arrival?
Yes, I provided him obviously with the details of what had taken place to that time. But again, it was him and effectively 2 DCs that would manage to muster in terms of the available resource.
How long were you at Hayfield Road before you went back to Kirkcaldy?
I don't think it was long. Again, with the locus protection measures in place overseen by DS Davidson, more or less negated my need to be there, conscious of the various other strands of the investigation that I needed to turn my attention to.
Right. What were they?
They're more or less listed on the day book.
Yes. Let's look at your day book just to see that list. And I think they're on the first couple of pages. We could maybe get that back on the screen. Sorry. It's PS 18495, I think. And there's a list on page 1. Does this assist you?
Yes, so it's better landscape. Yeah, and I don't know, again, with help with the timings, the 0910 hours is Chief Superintendent McEwen declaring it a critical incident. I don't know if I have briefed, whether I was conscious of briefing DS Dursley and the DCs on the events to deploy them to carry out these actions before I was able to sit down and start to note some of the considerations and timings. So it would be around about the same time.
So there would have been briefings going on that are they not noted in the day book?
No, I don't think so. And I think I was more conscious of getting them briefed and effectively getting them out the door to see how they could assist, because it was part of that information gathering stage. We know that there had been calls. We know, so there was lots to do. And again, it was just trying to work out in the fashion and priority to do that. It makes sense that I've briefed them first, especially in the knowledge that the call from Colette Bell came before 0910. So, and obviously DS Dursley and the 2 DCs were involved in contacting her, so it would make sense that when I've came back, and I think on the left hand side, which is redacted slightly, there was the call card number. I think that would be probably the first origin of source of information for me, would be to print that.
So we've heard that DS Dursley arrived at Kirkcaldy shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. We've heard evidence that DC Parker, had noted in his notebook at 8:20 a briefing, along with DC Mitchell. And we've heard that at 08:36 hours that there was a call from Colette Bell to the police from her home in Kirkcaldy, reporting her partner missing. And you've already given evidence today to say that at 0910 a critical incident was declared by Gary McEwen. So you've returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office, you've briefed various members of the police service, including DS Dursley. You've talked about some of them being briefed from the scene. Was there anyone else you briefed in that period of time between sort of after 8 and 9:10, so prior to Gary McEwen declaring it a critical incident.
So as I say, the first phone call, once I'd obviously spoken divisionally with Inspector Kay and the Chief Inspector, my first call was to the Detective Superintendent, and the first call obviously resulted in numerous calls thereafter. So, but in the
Is that Pat Campbell?
Yes, sorry.
No.
In the interim period, I have returned, probably on the phone and making various calls, because naturally he's briefed up the way as well, which has resulted in either questions or clarity that has resulted in another phone call. So, so it's managing that whilst trying to brief the available resource to go and carry out those priority actions.
So you're briefing up the chain and down the chain.
Yes.
And Pat Campbell, you've briefed him. Senior to him would have been Gary McEwen.
In terms of rank, yes, but in terms of the structure of that day, probably not. I mean, Gary McEwen was the commander of Fife. I actually don't know how he was made aware or contacted. It wouldn't be within that kind of crime management on-call structure, because there would be, from Detective Superintendent Pat Campbell, there would be a Detective Chief Superintendent on call from the crime management element.
Right.
And that's, I think, explained about the parallel supervisory ranks as well, in terms of Chief Inspector, Superintendent. So naturally, he's been contacted by somebody, but I don't think it would potentially be Pat Campbell's first call.
Right, thank you. I'm conscious of the
Right.
time.
We'll take a 15-minute break then.
Thank you.
Chief Inspector, I wonder if you could help me with, to clarify a matter at this point. Just going back to the scene at Hayfield Road and your decision in relation to the dealing with the, what you might call the forensic aspects of the knife and the batons and so forth. And you explained your decision to just have these collected and photographed in situ. Now, a little later in your evidence, you said that if you'd known from the outset, as you put it, that we were dealing with an unconscious male, and the fact that that could unfortunately be the outcome, I think there would have been a stop and pause at that time in terms of not recovering. So I think I was working on the premise that more as a precautionary measure, we were asking for an ambulance for the male. Do you remember saying that?
That's correct, yes.
Now, do I take it from that then that if you had known that he was unconscious at that time, you would have taken steps to preserve the scene?
That's correct.
And in relation to the other evidence that you gave about your role as the SIO, might that have meant that you would have taken charge at that point as the SIO?
Yeah, I think I was trying to convey that, and as I portrayed or attending initially just as an officer and supporting my colleagues, I think the actions and decisions that we took, I would be satisfied that a sergeant could take them at that time as well, but appreciating I was there, I became in charge. I gave that instruction to record and recover the items based on the information that had been provided in the assessment of the circumstances at that time.
But if you had realised that the man was unconscious, as you described, would that have affected you, the way in which you would have taken command?
Yeah, definitely, because I think the way I thought, and doubted how it would play out as I portrayed, is that the male would be taken into custody. Again, the provision of an ambulance to check him as a precautionary measure. If I knew he was at that stage in need of urgent medical attention, I would have obviously put in the locus protection measures at that time, which would have involved the knife and the officer equipment remaining in situ.
Well, against that background, I wonder if you could help me with this. If we could have on the screen your operational statement that you wrote the next day, which is, I think, PS 280, and at page 3. Now, it's at, it's about halfway down the page, paragraph 7, I think. Yes, if you see the second last paragraph on the page, it says, at that time I was made aware that the male was unconscious but was breathing and an ambulance had been requested. DC Connell thereafter contacted me and informed me that he had located the knife on a grass area on the north side of Hayfield Road. If you can scroll down to the next paragraph, it says, owing to the risk that this posed with members of the public being in the immediate vicinity and the potential evidential value, I instructed DC Connell and DS Davidson to record the position of the knife and take possession of same. The inclement weather, you referred to that as you did in your evidence, and also to the batons. You order that these be recorded and recovered. And then the next paragraph you say, you then conveyed PC Short to Victoria Hospital. Now, it would appear from that operational statement that you wrote the following day that the sequence of events was that you did know that he was unconscious before the recovering the productions was an issue.
I think it was probably more the emphasis about the unresponsive bit that I then became aware of.
I'm sorry?
The unresponsive element that obviously once I'd conveyed Nicole Short to the hospital and came out, he was unresponsive. So whether there was an impression that he was responding at that time in terms of whether he was breathing, I don't think I made the assessment that he was in need of urgent medical assistance.
So if you thought that if you knew that he was unconscious, would he not be in need of urgent medical assistance?
Yeah, I just think it was the unresponsive bit that to become aware of that I wish I'd reflected obviously on those actions.
Thank you. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Could I ask you to go back to page 7 of the spreadsheet, please? I've referred you to this earlier. I think page 10 was the call, the airwaves transmission from you at 7:28 and 46 seconds. Page 10, halfway down the page, where you say that you're going to convey PC Short to A&E. So page 7 is a time at which we've agreed earlier you were actually at the scene.
That's correct.
And the information that was available on the airwaves at that time from PC Alan Smith, so page 7, 7:25:17, is Roger, this male now certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him. So although you've said you thought maybe your radio was in the car, certainly officers at the scene, PC Smith in particular, who makes the transmission, and any officers listening to the radio transmissions would have known that he was unconscious and not responsive. Do you remember being aware of the not responsive part? I'm not sure how someone who was unconscious could be anything other than non-responsive.
You're right, and obviously it's sort of obviously outlined that. The reality is that the knife and the equipment should have been left in situ as the on reflection now, and if I had my time again, that would be the case.
Thank you. Just remaining with forensic recovery at the scene for a moment, could we look at paragraph 75, please? This is 75 of 133, your first inquiry statement. I think you say here, after recovering the knife, I find myself a bit redundant by that time, thinking that the matter was under control. An ambulance had been requested, but you were literally half a mile from Victoria Hospital on Cayfield Road. I thought that I would be best used by just nipping Nicole Short along to the hospital. So whether she'd been put in my car by that time, I'm not sure, but she was front seat passenger as I drove the short distance to A&E. Was that part of your thought process as well? Did you feel at that time that you were a bit redundant at that stage?
Following my initial response and support of my colleagues, and as I say, having had the discussion with DS Sammy Davidson and Sergeant Maxwell, yeah, at that time I thought my involvement had ceased.
And going back, I was asking you before the break about the different roles that everyone was taking, and I was asking you about DS Dursley at that stage. I'd like to move on and ask you about Acting Inspector Stevie Kay. He was the PIO. Yeah. We've heard evidence about this. And just ask you to give an explanation about some of the comments you've made in your statements.
Okay.
So the PERC statement, first of all, from the 2nd of June 2015, which is 223. And this relates to yourself. It's page 2, paragraph 3. And page 2, paragraph 3, you say, as part of this role, that's your role as being on duty SIO for Fife, particularly during a weekend where a serious incident occurred, I would be expected to respond and take initial control where appropriate. And then can we look at your first inquiry statement, which is 133 at paragraph 88. And you're talking about the welfare of the officers. You had to think about the welfare of the cops involved. It was that resilience and looking at what other staff members were on across Fife. And you talk about the PIO on that day was Stevie Kay. This is to the last few lines. He's got the day-to-day running of incident management, day business, plus resources resilience where he needs to allocate or realign staff. And then if I can look at your second inquiry statement at paragraph 66, and this is SBPI 251. In paragraph 66, you talk about Inspector Stevie Kay would be more in charge of the uniform response as the police incident officer, PIO. And I'm just wondering if you can give a more detailed explanation to the chair about how he can interpret all of these different comments about you being expected to respond and take initial control, but Kay being more in charge, and just trying to understand how to interpret those different comments.
I think in the initial statement in terms of the expected to respond to the critical incident, that doesn't ordinarily mean physically. It could just be to the area where it's taken place, and I could have that remote control over what is taking place based on the information that was being fed to me, because ordinarily you're not on this day I was in the location where this took place, but if I was in another location, that control might have been remote and I might have been given the instructions from afar, naturally then attending, given the gravity of it. But it's appreciating that there's that collective responsibility in various strands to investigations, that I had the criminal investigation element in terms of the structure and response, whereas you've got the PIO in terms of your parallel colleague who would be dealing with the uniform element in terms of what maybe resources I needed from the uniform, but also on this instance, and correlated with this, was the uniform resilience that was required to come and police Kirkcaldy, because policing had to continue on that day, but also support the investigation as well. So it is a collective, just us having clear different roles and responsibilities.
So would it have been an option for you to have taken remote control of the incident at Hayfield Road at any point?
So if I hadn't attended from Kirkcaldy and I'd been based elsewhere, the instructions may have come over the radio or over the phone. I may have had a call from DS Davidson to report, and based on that, I'm glad I was there. Obviously, naturally reflecting on some of the actions, the decisions I took, but it was easier to be there and see what was going on, to base the decisions around that, as opposed to relying on something that was being conveyed over a phone or over a radio.
And your control to that extent would have been as SIO, on duty SIO that day?
Yes.
And explain briefly what the SIO does in terms of an investigation. You've talked previously about priorities.
Yeah. So it would be, as I say, the investigative oversight of any matter. It doesn't have to be a crime, it could be a death, and it is providing that assistant guidance and support of the investigation, whether it is actions, support to your colleagues, just giving that overall, as I say, kind of peer review. And if it's just the one incident, the actions and priorities that are required as part of that, naturally, we don't always deal with just one. There's a competing demands across policing ordinarily on a daily basis.
Can you be used as a resource by other officers who are seeking guidance?
Yes, definitely. So depending on the matter that's brought to your attention, it depends on the response or level of support that's required. It could just be like consultation, the fact that as that kind of soundboard of an incident they're dealing with, what actions have taken place, what their intended actions, and that agreement that they would go and progress that. There's obviously other matters like this that would need more of a focus and involvement, direct involvement from me.
We've heard other evidence that you were in charge initially at Kirkcaldy Police Office, but ultimately directed by Detective Superintendent Campbell. And you would direct the investigation and decide on the priorities. Do you agree with that description of your role?
Yeah, there was obviously a point, and I think it's obviously policed as well, that the transfer of SIO did take place, and that Detective Superintendent Pat Campbell became the SIO.
When was that?
I think it was the first goal group meeting. Was that at 11:30?
Yes, and if we look at your daybook for the moment, page 1 of your daybook, which we looked at earlier, you'll see that initially your handwriting was 0910. We've heard that was a critical incident, and then 11:30 is the time given. If we go on to the next, I think it might be page 2, and we see that the gold group, which was a gold group meeting, was at 11:30. So as far as you're concerned, were you in charge of the investigation up until 11:30?
That was my understanding, yeah.
How did you gain that understanding?
Because I was there, naturally I was seeking, having the initial update to Detective Super Campbell. He was obviously giving me, not saying instructions straight away, but after the initial brief then, in terms of my intended actions, the agreement around that about what the course of action would be, because at that time he was remote. I think he was obviously somewhere in the west of Scotland.
When did he give you your initial brief?
So I gave him the initial brief. Yeah, as I say, just having come out of the hospital, and the conversation around the locus, the conversation with Inspector Kay, and the involvement of Chief Inspector Stones. The next call was to the on-call Detective Superintendent.
So when we looked at the spreadsheet earlier, towards the end, there was the mention of Dursley and Stones,
Yep.
and you said you were going to call the Detective Super.
Yeah.
It was shortly after that.
Definitely,
that
I think I
called
obviously
Pat Campbell.
wanted to get that support notified and on the way, as opposed to any further delay. I think at that time would have been the opportunity to phone the Detective Superintendent.
And you remained in charge of the investigation until Pat Campbell attended the 11:30 Gold Group meeting.
Physically, yes, but naturally, as the time passed, there was obviously instruction and dialogue with him of matters that he would look for us to progress or secure.
Was there a moment in time where he was in charge of the investigation and you were relieved of that responsibility?
It never felt as the goal group felt as the handover, because the structure of the goal group I gave, at number 2 there, I gave that investigatory update in terms of what led us to be in the room at that time, up until that stage. That would have included, as part of my update, the information that I relayed to Detective Superintendent, naturally the mechanisms that took place after that, which basically meant that the senior officers descended on Kirkcaldy on that morning.
Right. Well, we'll come back to the Gold Group meetings. Now, we've heard evidence that Acting Inspector Kay arrived at the scene of Hayfield Road at 7:40. In fact, we have a note on the spreadsheet that he arrived at 7:40 and 54 seconds, which is page 15, if you wanted to look at it. I think in paragraph 88 of your inquiry statement, you say that you were the most senior officer at the scene at the time you were there, and you were the same rank as Stevie Kay. So when Inspector Kay arrived, were you were the same rank as him, but were you still the most senior officer at the scene?
We were, yes. I actually don't recall ever seeing him at the scene. I don't think it was more the remote contact that we had.
You've said in one of your statements that Stevie K, this is your second inquiry statement at paragraph 66. You say Stevie K would be more in charge. And again, I'm just trying to understand what you mean by that. So you say here, Inspector Stevie K would be more in charge of the uniform response as the police incident officer. On that day, we responded as a collective, as police officers, without the initial, though, about the supervisor element and to who was in charge. Post-incident, and given how it developed, I assumed SIO ownership or oversight. So when you say that Stevie K was more in charge, what is it you mean there?
It was naturally his officers, in effect, that attended in terms of the uniform response. So on a day-to-day basis, he would prioritise the deployment of uniform resources across Fife, depending on that kind of threat, risk and harm. So they were his officers, so he attended in terms of their welfare and support, but also appreciating the wider requirements in terms of that resilience of officers to continue to police Kirkcaldy, and also there was elements that he would take responsibility for in terms of the the officers that did the locus protection. So again, once I made him aware of the requirement, he would then go and find that suitable resource to perform those functions.
So if we were to narrow this down, he's more in charge of the uniformed officers, you're more in charge of the investigation and how that's conducted.
But naturally on that day the uniform officers became part of the investigation, which on a day-to-day basis doesn't happen.
So there's an overlap, if you like, of the individuals involved. And you were going at some point to look at your day book before the break to tell me about the type of priority actions that you were thinking about that day. Do you want to go back to your day book, please? And I think, could you read out what we see here as things that you considered in terms of the investigation and what was required?
Yeah, so again, these are the kind of triggers of what relate to fairly generic strands of investigation that exist no matter what incident that you're dealing with. So I think we've covered both times there. The TSU, I think, is a prompt there with regards to CCTV relating to one of the vans that attended the incident. So I think that's a trigger for that. And then thereafter, you would have, as I say, as part of any investigation, victims, deceased, locus, your witnesses. So I think TSU covers the van, the deceased in terms of Mr. Bio, the locus at that time is Hayfield Road, 360 is in photo is in terms of the recording of that scene. So that was when I think I referred to the scenes of crime officers, that they would attend and provide that specialism in terms of capturing the scene visually.
We've heard some evidence about that.
They would be the ones that, again, if on reflection, would have photographed and recorded the items that we've discussed. I think that in terms of my handwriting, I think that's Shahid Saeed, and that's tie, so it's trace and eliminate, evaluate the movements of the witness, because his name had been introduced by Colette. I think that's then, as Martin Dick. After that, it's like DNED, but I don't know what that, in terms of my own scribbles. But he was identified as a witness again from the information
we've heard
provided. The H to H is house-to-house parameters. So again, from where the incident took place, what houses would fall into that? Naturally, it happened right outside a row of houses, so they would probably be the first port of call. Intelligence profiles, so again, in terms of any individual linked to an investigation, we would look to, as part of building that information and knowledge around it, we would look to see what information was held on police systems to help build the picture of what we're dealing with. CCTV survey, as it says, is we would look to canvass any property, and again how that's evolved through technology, but any source of CCTV from houses, and obviously Gallagher's had some dash cams
in the area.
Yeah.
And then if we move down the page, do we see what other?
I think it's not, is it redacted in my? So in
There
terms
we
of
are.
obviously Kirkcaldy and Locus, I don't know can't recall what they redacted.
It'll be an address in Kirkcaldy.
So again,
that
as
you've
we built
identified.
that, and as the more people were contacted in those early stages, the more information we gleaned, and that then led to further decisions and actions around what we needed to do. So we knew, well, for instance, if that is Colette's address, knowing that there seems to be the chronology as I've noted it, that seems to be information that's been gleaned from the officer's contact with Colette, and the consideration is, does that address, or does any address that's associated to this become a locus, something that we would look to attend, secure, not knowing what the value was contained within there. Media, again, it's always a early consideration in terms of any proactive messaging, but also recognising the media attention and how we manage that. I think the next one's community. So again, it's that community impact. As a result of that incident, what is the likelihood in terms of community impact? These are not all strands that I would necessarily progress. They would be allocated during a briefing, or in this terms, the gold group. Federation reps was directed in terms of the welfare of the officers, in terms of somebody coming out to support them. And I think, well, the next one's welfare of the officers.
So these are all aspects of the investigation that would need to be dealt with, not necessarily by you individually, but delegated perhaps to others who would task.
Yeah, and some of that would fall, as I say, even in discussion at the early stages with Inspector K, in terms of if we wanted to do them without the formal structure and briefing, if we saw them as those, and if we had the priority actions that I may have looked for a resource from Inspector K to go and do CCTV at the pub, CCTV at the houses, or door to door at the houses.
So you were able to tap into assistance from Inspector K?
Yeah.
And you were able to rely on DS Dursley?
Yes.
And him tasking other officers who had been drafted in to the area. And you also had support from more senior people
Yes.
up the chain. Can I ask you one last thing in relation to Maxwell and Smith? So thinking about who was in charge of the care and welfare of the officers. Now, you've mentioned that at the end of your day book as being a factor, a matter of importance. And in your second inquiry statement at paragraph 67, you, if we just look at that, and I think it says, if you're talking about who's in charge of care and welfare of Sheku, I'd say Alan Smith. Mr. Bale was on the ground and the officers were around. And so you seem to attribute, certainly at the scene, that PC Alan Smith was in charge of the care and welfare of Mr. Bale. And we've heard evidence before that Alan Smith was a PC, and you've said in your evidence that he was an OST trainer, and we've heard he was first aid trained. We've also heard that Scott Maxwell was acting sergeant for the response team, and he was of more senior rank than PC Smith. Can you explain to us why you would attribute the in charge of care and welfare of Mr. Bio to PC Smith rather than acting police sergeant Maxwell?
More because he was more suitably qualified in terms of his skills and experience, and as I say, it was an observation to me because on my attendance it was the only really officer I could hear, and I did then take comfort identifying him and with his background that, as I say, he was best placed and with the knowledge and experience to do that.
Were you aware of Alan Smith's training and background when you arrived at the scene?
Yeah, because I think he trained me in OST, so.
So it was that, your awareness of him and his background rather than a particular policy or procedure that is implemented that you're aware of?
Yeah, and to be honest, I suppose that's when the rank structure was effectively put to the side as the best person for the job. And I did take confidence that with Alan being there, that all these initial considerations and factors would be taken into account. With his
So that's why you have said in your statement, Smith was in charge of looking after Mr. Bio rather than Sergeant Maxwell.
Yeah, and I suppose if there was anybody else with similar skills and experience would support that as well. But I wasn't aware of anybody else.
And you then say Scott Maxwell would be in charge of the element of the officers and the supervisory oversight, but Alan Smith was dealing with care and welfare. What do you mean in charge of the element of the officers and the supervisory oversight?
So I think there obviously his officers on the team, again with the acting or temporary element. I don't know how long that had been, but I suppose when at the start, commencement of their shift, if there was an opportunity, he'd be the one briefing them and with supervisory responsibility on that day. Again, because he was there at the time, he wasn't directly involved. Again, an important thing of supervisory oversight is that if you were to then become physically involved in one element, I suppose then it limits you to how you can have a holistic view of the incident.
Right. Thank you. Well, let's go back to looking at Kirkcaldy Police Office. You've returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office and you've given evidence that at 9:10, Gary McEwen declared a critical incident, and at 11:30 there's a handover, if you like, where you give the briefing to the Gold Group meeting, but Pat Campbell is there and there's effectively a handover. I'm interested in what you were doing between 9:10 and 11:30 when you attended that first Gold Group meeting. Now, we've looked at page 1 of your daybook. Is there any other sort of information available from your daybook that would assist us in understanding what you were doing personally during that period?
So again, knowing the kind of scale and gravity of the matter in terms of that administrative responsibility, instead of from what was done in my daybook, I started to populate an action book, which is a separate document. Mm-hmm. To what extent I populated that action book in advance of the Gold Group, I couldn't tell you. I know I was more involved in that in the afternoons following the Gold Group meetings.
Were you involved in any briefings alongside DS Dursley in the morning? So
definitely on their initial attendance, in terms of whether it was just to DS Dursley. I don't think so, because they were a refined resource. This wasn't briefing a cast of 1,000. It was a sergeant and 2 detective constables. I definitely gave them or relayed the information I had at that stage based on my views and experience, also supported by the call card that we were in possession of.
So after returning to Kirkcaldy Police Office, had you reviewed the call card? We've heard also called storm card messages that had come in that day.
Definitely printed it. In terms of review, and to what extent I couldn't tell you at that time, but I know it was, in terms of the briefing of the limited information I had to hand, any initial action that I considered was more or less superseded by the call from Colette Bell, and then that brought about the link of who we had made contact with at Hayfield Road, and that's what I used the available resource to be overseen by DS Dursley of those 3 DCs to deploy.
We've heard evidence that Colette Bell's call came in at 08:36, and we heard evidence from DS Dursley that there was a potential link made between the call from Colette Bell and the male who had become unconscious at the scene.
Yep.
And we've also heard life wasn't pronounced extinct until 09:04.
Yeah.
To what extent were you aware of the call from Colette Bell and the link or the connection being made?
Yeah, we were all together, as I say, we were effective. That would have been in the midst of, if not just the conclusion of the brief. I think it was in the midst because I don't have anything noted that was said that the DCs at our disposal at that time were allocated a certain action before that was then superseded, prioritised by the call from Colette. So I think it was round about the same time.
We heard that DC Dursley say that he was in a room with you at one point. You used a room together.
Yeah.
Was that in the morning?
I think by the time I potentially got back, in the morning, the time I got back to the station, Kirkcaldy Police Station, I think DS Dursley and his 2 DCs had arrived.
Right. And is that Mitchell and Parker?
That's correct.
Was there also a Callum Clayton present?
Yes, sorry.
And once you became aware of the call from Colette Bell and made that connection, was it you that made the connection or DS Dursley?
I couldn't tell you.
And we've heard from DS Dursley that he tasked Mitchell and Parker and Clayton to go to visit Colette Bell at her home, and he sent all 3 of them there.
That's correct, and it's more likely to be DS Dursley given the fact that my, at that time, commitment on the phone to Detective Superintendent Campbell.
What information, what you've talked about a briefing, talked about being there at the time. We've heard about a briefing where Mitchell and Parker were given a briefing on the events. Do you remember what briefing was given?
If it was a briefing by me, I would have just relayed pretty much chronological how the day had started and how it had unfolded, just exactly as the operational statement in terms of commencing duty, awareness of the call, the response, the actions at the scene, potentially obviously my actions, the resulting outcome in terms of obviously Mr. Bowen taken to hospital, the locus preservation. Just really, probably I've just walked through in my eyes because that's what I knew. In terms of obviously the more detailed interaction at the scene at that stage, I didn't know.
Was there any notes prepared about the briefing in advance of the briefing that you used?
No, again, just due to the kind of immediacy and urgency, there wasn't. It's naturally take the time to prepare a briefing in terms of what you're trying to achieve, the resource at your disposal and how you allocate that. There's usually some more thought, but because of the dynamic nature and because it was still fast-paced and ongoing, it was just hot actions, basically, just immediate actions that had come about from the call to Colette, and the only effectively resource at that time that were available to us.
So there were no notes in the day book
No,
about
no.
the briefing that was given. And do you remember what you were doing when Mitchell and Parker and Clayton went to Colette Bell's?
Again, because of the kind of timeline of events, and obviously at that time I would still be in dialogue with DS Davison as well in terms of events at the hospital. So because there was still new and emerging information, I would probably be relaying that on the phone back to Detective Super Campbell. Again, then just to probably, as events changed, as to kind of checks and balances against if we're still doing the right thing, what else do we need to consider?
Were you aware of conversations between the officers who had gone to visit Colette Bell and DS Dursley?
Potentially not at the time, but I obviously was made aware. First and foremost was to deploy them. Colette had made the call, is to go and speak with her, and how that would, I suppose at that time we didn't know where that would take us. But knowing obviously the concern that she was raising and the links that we had made, it was really to deploy in the first instance and then take it from there.
At some point, did you become aware that Mitchell and Parker had returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office with Colette Bell?
Yeah, and I think in fairness there would have been dialogue between me and DS Dursley, whether it was in person or on the phone. Most likely in person. The only time I was not available was when I would be on the phone. So every time, knowing that he was a source of information, because obviously what he deployed officers to do, would be back in to check if there was any update. So I would probably be aware of a lot more prior to knowing that she was coming been brought back to the police station.
How much time did you spend in the room with DS Dursley that morning?
Again, that became our base for the day, effectively, but again, with the contact that I had with DS Davidson, I would probably go out with to another room for just the not seeing the privacy, but just a kind of environment that I could hear the update. So I would have been in and out the same location at various points.
Was DS Davidson elsewhere in Kirkcaldy that day? In Kirkcaldy Police Office?
So she was at the locus for a period of time to ensure that we'd put the locus
Local
measures
protection measures.
in place, and then if I recall, she obviously has ended up at the hospital at some point, maybe granting that was to assist with identification of, at that time, have not known the identity of Mr. Bio.
When Colette Bell came back to Kirkcaldy Police Office, you were aware, we've heard from DS Dursley, you were aware by the time she came back, well, she came to Kirkcaldy Police Office, that you were aware that Mr. Bio had died.
Yes.
And I think DS Dursley was at that stage of the view that there was a connection between her missing partner and the male who had died in Victoria Hospital. Was that something you were fully up to date on at that time?
Because of the introduction of the name when she's called, when we've done inquiries, and I think it's obviously been in evidence in terms of us obtaining a photo. So I think that was part of DS Davidson's job, was to come back and collect that photo to go to the hospital to confirm, or at least give an indication of Mr. Bio was the person at hospital. And I think coupled that with the information about a phone as well that was in his possession or next to him in Hayfield Road.
Can I ask you about the identification of the male in the hospital? Could we look at PS 00280, page 5, paragraphs 3 and 4? And you'll see it's just beneath the part that's redacted.
Yeah.
And it says here, a social media site provided a more recent picture. And then DS Davidson has thereafter attended at the Victoria Hospital and, along with DC Connell, compared the recent image with the deceased and confirmed his identity. I'm interested in this method of identification through the social media picture. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was happening?
Yeah, so I think initially, prior to considering that, we may have, with the details provided, researched police systems, and within that, potentially, if there was any kind of previous chronology of or record on police systems and a photo, we may have used that. I think at that time, any kind of evidential value, and again, I don't think it's common course that we would use social media images as part of an evidential chain, but I suppose it's like intelligence, is that we were really keen to know the identity of the male who was at the hospital. I think given the introduction of Zaid's name by Colette as well, and some form of altercation between him and Mr. Bio, either in the hours previous to our involvement, it was just a really sense of urgency to identify who we had at the hospital.
So you're distinguishing what you're calling an evidential chain and
Yeah.
intelligence.
Yeah.
And so whose decision was it to use a photo from social media?
So again, I think, as I've listed in my day, the intelligence profiles, I don't know if that time, if we had some form of, and again, we would have a provision of, at the weekend, of staff that work within our intel offices. We also had support staff that work within the police stations that may have been actioned with doing those checks once we were provided with the name. In terms of a decision, it may have been ran past me, I can't recall, but I'm quite satisfied that was the right thing to do.
So looking back now, you don't have any concerns about using a social media picture?
No, and in fairness, but prior to refreshing, and obviously the passage of time, I was actually maybe of the opinion that it was an image sourced from police computer. But again, it's the same concept of printing an image from whatever source with a view in terms of urgency to identify who we had at the hospital.
And generally, do you have concerns about using images from social media as a means of identification?
So we've done it previously, or it has been done in terms of form of potentially indicative identification, but that's always then supported with the evidential element.
We heard evidence from DS Dursley that I think he would have expected a more formal identification prior to post-mortem. Was that your expectation at that time?
I think at this stage we wouldn't got as far or even considering post-mortem. It was because of, I'm not saying there was ever debate about who we had, but for in terms of confirmation to then understand the next steps of what we would do and what information we may consider disclosing, we had to try and be as sure as best we can with the limitations of what we're in control of to identify who that person was at the hospital.
And what would your expectation be in relation to a more formal identification prior to post-mortem?
So again, in the experience of death investigations, which I've pretty much got a large experience, we know in terms of the functioning we perform for death investigations is we're agents of the Procurator Fiscal. So in normal death investigations, in terms of identification prior to post-mortem, in consultation with Procurator Fiscal, we would look for potentially, if there was police involvement, officers or witnesses that identified the person in death in terms of when the police involvement, to then people that would identify them in life, and that usually is next to kin, friends, family.
So looking back now, you would have expected or anticipated that next of kin would have been involved in some form of identification.
Yeah, but the priority was to identify who we had before we consider who then the next of kin is, yes.
Yeah. I'm going to move on now to the management of the officers at Kirkcaldy Police Office. And
Stop there then. So we'll continue with your evidence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Chief Inspector.